In terms of philosophy, World of Warcraft has probably changed more in the last 5 years than it had in the 19 years prior. However, it doesn't really feel like that because a lot of these changes have reintroduced experiences that existed in the early days of WoW. Now, more than ever, there is a version of World of Warcraft to make everyone happy. However, knowing which World of Warcraft to start with or which version is right for you can be quite the daunting task. In today's video, we're going to explore which version of World of Warcraft is right for you in 2024. Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name is, of course, Csaw or Chris, and today we're playing World of Warcraft in 2024. However, the real question is which World of Warcraft are we playing in 2024? As mentioned, there have been a tremendous amount of changes that have come to WoW over the last 5 years, and a lot of these changes have to do with the idea of multiple versions of the game existing. Whereas prior to that, we've only just had retail WoW that has continued to go through multiple different expansions and seeing the actual gameplay and systems change over time. Now we have these different instances of the game that have been preserved for players who have been longing to return back to classic WoW or back to Wrath of the Lich King, and now could have that experience fulfilled in today's modern age of gaming. And World of Warcraft is far from the only game doing this. One of the best examples of kind of a leader in this is old school RuneScape. RuneScape, obviously another big MMORPG that had a very loyal fan base that followed it for many, many years, saw the retail version of their game, or RuneScape 3 as it's called now, change a lot over those years. And much like World of Warcraft, many of these changes are done at such a slow pace over 20 years that it doesn't seem like the game's changing in any individual patch. But once you add them all up, the game that is currently playable in RuneScape 3 is almost not comparable to what old school RuneScape was. And JDEX saw this and they released old school RuneScape, which was kind of recapturing a lot of the experiences and emotions of that older version of the game. And they not only just released it, but they've built upon it and explored new ways that they could progress that older version of the game with those systems intact and introduce new content for players to enjoy. And I think a lot of the success that was seen in old school RuneScape probably gave Blizzard the green light to say, hey, we're potentially sitting on a gold mine of content that our loyal fan base from the past would love to come back and experience. And 5 years later, it certainly looks like this is the case, where not only did they release that vanilla WoW for players to experience again, or for new fans of World of Warcraft to experience for the first time, but they've also gone a step further and explored different ways to expand that story, either going back through the different expansions or playing with the way the server works through Season of Mastery, Season of Discovery, Hardcore, Self-Found, all these different ways that they can make the experience similar but unique in its own right. And of course, all of these different versions of the game weren't released just at one time, because that would have been overwhelming for absolutely everyone, but were introduced at different points throughout these 5 years. So I think the next thing to do in this video is just do a quick history or timeline of these different servers, highlighting when they came out and which ones are still available to play. So the very first one was the launch of Classic WoW, or I guess like the relaunch of Classic WoW, which happened on August 26, 2019, which is crazy that it was that long ago, because it seems like a pretty new thing still. But this was the relaunch of essentially Classic WoW with some very minor changes, with the vision of really trying to keep the game as similar to what it was for players to re-experience in different ways. Obviously, the way that this kind of continued was having the initial launch, going through the different patches of vanilla WoW, and then eventually going through into the different versions of the game as we get to different expansions. So for instance, we had the classic TBC version of the game launched June 1st, 2021, and then the classic Wrath version of the game launched September 26, 2022, and then the classic Cataclysm version of the game is likely to launch in the first half of 2024, so that hasn't even come yet, and I would expect it will at least continue into Mist of Pandaria, because I know that that is an expansion that a lot of people remember fondly. There is a question at which point continuing down this route, we eventually get to a game that's no longer classic WoW and is retail WoW, just like slightly behind the times. So there is a question as to if it will go through literally every single expansion. Like, I struggle to see them doing Shadowlands Classic, but maybe they will one day. Who knows? Because the other part of this is, the more time goes on, the more time there has been since those expansions. So, if Shadowlands is legitimately 10 years ago, maybe there is warrant for them to do a Shadowlands Classic. I don't know. But that's kind of where we're at. One of the key things I do want to illustrate here, though, is that there was a decision made where, once they've moved past classic TBC, there is no longer a TBC version of the game that you can play. It moved on to Wrath, similar to what retail did, and it's just gone. Whereas they have kept perpetually a classic version of vanilla WoW's endgame for people to continue to experience and enjoy, and it's that base that they do a lot of these different seasonal servers, Season of Mastery, Season of Discovery, or Hardcore, kind of with that base version of vanilla WoW, which we'll get into in just a second. So that's kind of the first introduction, was going back through the classic versions of the game, which makes a lot of sense, but it does highlight that initial issue that if you were someone who wanted to play the Burning Crusade version of World of Warcraft right now, there's still not an option really to do that through any of the official servers. And so this is where World of Warcraft started to experiment with the servers and introduce these different seasonal servers that had a few more, nifty changes to them that made them a different experience for players who, not only wanted to re-experience things exactly where they were, but see some different things in their leveling process. The first of these was the Season of Mastery, and this launched on November 16th, 2021, which again seems so far away. Resets back to the initial launch of vanilla, and essentially this just had some adjusted XP rates, adjusted leveling, metas and stuff like that to give people a very different feeling of going through the same content. There were certain things that had different difficulties and stuff like that, so it was similar but kind of different. This server actually came to an end on February 14th, 2023, and it allowed players that had a character on this seasonal server to transfer it back to the Era server for free, which again, the Era server being the one that is perpetually at endgame vanilla. This did a lot of things because it not only introduced players to the idea of servers that worked differently than what they'd experienced in the past, but it showed how seasonal servers would work in World of Warcraft, with the idea of having a character that's on the seasonal server, and eventually that seasonal server comes to an end, and that character or characters can be brought to a Era server where they can continue to exist in at least a version of the game, right? Because that is one of the more complicated things when we look at seasonal stuff. It kind of contrasts to what we know about MMOs in general. MMOs are supposed to be this perpetual world that always exists and that we can count on. And if now we have these seasonal servers and MMOs that are, by definition, a limited time thing, it's kind of a jarring experience for new players especially, but for players in general to understand and accept. So really knowing how that process worked in World of Warcraft was very important before they dove into their next seasonal servers. Now, some of these servers that they also introduced that aren't necessarily seasonal, but were a different way of playing, included Hardcore World of Warcraft, and this launched on August 24th, 2023, which is actually pretty recent. Now, this version of the game is pretty easy to understand. Essentially, it is World of Warcraft Classic Vanilla with permadeath. This was initially made popular through a bunch of different add-ons that people were using to kind of make this server a reality on the Classic Era server. Blizzard obviously saw that people enjoyed playing like this and thought, hey, we could, do a polished version of this that is official, and they launched it, and it was very popular and still continues to be pretty popular on a lot of different servers. The next seasonal server was Season of Discovery, and this was launched November 30th, 2023. And this is really the server that I think a lot of people were excited to see, because this was World of Warcraft's first venture into what Classic Plus could look like. And, a lot of people argue if this is exactly what Classic Plus is or not. I think a lot of people see Classic Plus as, essentially the normal vanilla era server, getting to the last patch of vanilla WoW and then continuing the story, but in a different way than we saw Retail WoW go. This is a bit different because it actually rewrites different parts of the game on the way to level 60, right? So we see a Black Fathom's Depths raid, whereas that wasn't in the original release. We see a Nomergon raid, which wasn't in the initial release. We see a lot of changes to classes, not only in terms of getting new abilities and talents and stuff like that, but also new roles that they never got to do. We saw Warlock tanks, we see Shaman tanks, we see Rogue tanks, we see Mage healers. We're seeing a lot of changes that kind of felt like they would never make their way into an official World of Warcraft classic server that were introduced. They were willing to make big changes here, and that was really interesting for people to see. One of the other really fun things about this seasonal server is that it was done in phases. So instead of some of the last few versions of the game where people would be really hyped for launch and then kind of no life it for, a couple weeks or a month or whatever the race to 60 was, this had a whole bunch of different start points. So the phase 1 version of this server went to a max level of 25, which was a lot shorter than the level 60 race and was more approachable for a lot of people, but also had this really interesting thing where we got to see what a max level of 25 felt like with a raid that, was at level 25 and had everyone with like kind of just their beginner abilities and stuff like that. Phase 2 then went to level 40, and that's currently what we're in when this video is being produced. And, continued phases will have different level caps until we get to 60 and see what the end game of this server really looks like. Assumably, going down the same road that we saw Season of Mastery, where eventually they will retire the server, and I'd assume you'd be able to take some of your characters away. However, the question here is, obviously this server works a lot differently than an era server, so you couldn't just bring a character from this server with all of the different runes to it, but maybe you're able to bring a level 60 version of that class to that server if you want. But there's a lot of territory for them to explain in terms of what this server looks like. And there is a world where maybe they just continue this as a Classic Plus server, and this is the server that they choose to explore what level 70 in this new version of Classic WoW looks like and stuff like that. So it's very interesting to see that way. The final version that has been released at this point is the Classic Hardcore Self-Found mode, which was launched February 29th, 2024, so very recent here. This is a further option to the hardcore servers that were launched back in August 24th, 2023, with kind of a checkbox that you can activate to go into self-found mode. And this really restricts players even further. So not only is it a permadeath server, but at this point you can only use items that are crafted or found or looted by your own player. So you're really funding yourself in this regards. It's not a solo self-found where, there was an add-on choice that was similar to this that made it so you had to play by yourself. There were very specific rules about it, but it was much more focused on solo play. That's not necessarily the case with this option. This one's more about self-funding as opposed to, what we've seen in hardcore is a lot of players will get a whole bunch of funding from either their other characters or from their audiences or friends, and then buy all of this really good gear that makes it so the permadeath is, a lot less risky for low levels. This kind of restricts that and forces people to be on a much more even playing field as they go through it. So it is a cool option. It'll be interesting to see if they explore more of these different toggles. But it is this territory where it gets a little bit more confusing for a new player, where you can now play all of these different modes, and you even have different options within the mode to make it a different experience, which kind of needs a bit more of an exploration, and that's what we're going to do in the next section of this video. So the first thing we need to do is determine which versions of World of Warcraft are still available to play in 2024, or at least at the time that this video is being made. The most obvious of which is Retail WoW. This is the most classic version of World of Warcraft that has continued throughout time. Currently it is in the Dragonflight expansion, and then it will go into the War Within expansion, and we even know the two expansions that come after that. So there's pretty long-term staying power here with, a lot of dev resources going into it, as it is still the main game mode. It is also the game mode that is the most current in terms of modern mechanics and complexities. You have kind of the three pillar types of content of raids, Mythic Plus dungeons, and PvP content, though it should be said PvP has received maybe a little bit less love than some of the others in the past. That said, we do have some exciting stuff in terms of perhaps different battlegrounds coming to the game and stuff like that, so maybe there will be a bit of resurgence for PvP in the future as well. Hey, so in the process of editing this video, World of Warcraft actually introduced yet another way to play World of Warcraft in 2024, and that is of course World of Warcraft Plunderstorm, their newest Battle Royale mode, which if I knew I was gonna be saying those words when I first started making this video, there was not a chance of me guessing that, but man is it on topic for this video. Because yeah, if you're a new person who has never played WoW, and your friends are like, hey, come play with us, and you're looking up online how to play WoW, and all of a sudden you're seeing this Battle Royale mode, you'd be a little confused. Because yeah, there's never been more ways to play World of Warcraft. So it's a battle royale mode in the World of Warcraft engine, the retail engine, that makes use of a lot of the abilities that you can play, but it's on a variety of different classes. And kind of mashes them all together. But yeah, to get into the game, you essentially download retail. You don't need to have purchased the newest expansion like Dragonflight, so you don't need to purchase that, but you do need an active subscription. So both retail players and anyone playing any of the other classic or seasonal games that we talked about can access this. Though I will say it probably aligns more with the desire of retail players, or just people who like Battle Royale instead. But yes, you go in through the retail game, which I assume means you need to download all of Retail WoW to play this game, which sounds like a huge amount of space to play a Battle Royale, but still. Once you go into the retail launcher, go into the game, this is the character selection screen from the retail game. You can see in the top left there is the option to play Dragonflight or to play the Plunderstorm limited time event, and this is a limited time event. They have said though if there's enough interest they would look at ways to keep it in the game. Clearly a lot of time and effort went into it, so I feel like unless it's completely not popular, they're going to find ways for this to return or become, a mainstay feature of the game, or just its own separate game or something like that. Anyways, so you go in there, you click on that, you create just a random character using the WoW character creator, and then you go into the Battle Royale mode really quick. Obviously, one of the objectives of this was to make a very approachable version of World of Warcraft for people to experience, and that definitely does work. It gets people in. The actual experience is nothing like World of Warcraft because it's not a battle royale. But yeah, so you're going in, you collect these skills, you level up your character, and you fight off enemy teams. And like a battle royale, there's a storm that's closing. You're trying to be the last team that's there, and then you win. You earn prizes or cosmetics for both retail and I think it's Wrath that you also get some stuff for. So there's some stuff you can collect, which is great, and that's one of the main reasons I think they're trying to drive, obviously, their existing player base into it. But yeah, that's pretty much the game, which is really interesting. I don't know how many people will be drawn to it. I think as a main, as a World of Warcraft player, I don't really have a huge issue with them doing this. I think the people who have the most issue with this, and probably the most deserved issue with this, is anyone who really enjoys PvP gameplay in World of Warcraft. There has not been a lot of new PvP features or battlegrounds. There's one coming actually in the next expansion, which is super exciting. But there hasn't been much in the game for a while. And for this to have clearly taken as much development time as it has, it is a little bit ridiculous. But yeah, anyway, so yet another way that you can play World of Warcraft in 2024. Let's get back to the video. Thank you. Next, we have the Era Classic servers. This is the World of Warcraft vanilla servers that will be, staying at the end game for vanilla World of Warcraft. It gives players that opportunity to always jump back into vanilla WoW and experience that for the first time. We then have WoW Classic Wrath. This is the classic servers that kind of continuously go through the past expansions. We're currently at Wrath. Soon it'll be Cataclysm. Depending on when you watch this video, it might even be Pandaria. It's going to keep going through them. Again, we don't really know what the end goal of this is, if it will just keep going through all the expansions, even into the more modern ones, or if eventually it'll kind of restart and go back through them. That's up for debate. We have WoW Classic Hardcore, which is that permadeath mode. Season of Discovery, which is the more rambunctious classic WoW that does have these different level caps. Currently it's capped at level 40, and you have a lot of these new roles and abilities that you can play, which is really cool. And then you have the WoW Classic Hardcore with Self-Found Active, which is a permadeath mode that has a little bit of extra hoops to jump through because you have to fund yourself. So you have a lot of different options here. The only ones that you can't play that kind of have come and gone is the classic Burning Crusade server, and eventually here the classic Wrath of the Lich King server, and then also the Season of Mastery. So those have already kind of gone and passed, and you can't really jump into those. That said, there is still a lot of opportunity to jump into a different type of WoW, and it really comes, the difficult part with this, and I was really weighing the pros and the cons of these types of servers, but one of the major cons is that it is a bit intimidating for new and returning players to know which version of the game to jump into. And I think, for a lot of people, if you're jumping into World of Warcraft for the first time, or if you're just trying to get back into the swing of it, retail probably still makes the most sense just to get warmed up. One of the beauties of this system, and this probably will be its own video itself, is the fact that you don't have to pay any additional money for any of these servers. These are all covered in the base Blizzard subscription fee for WoW, so they're really just value adds to the actual product. The only difference is that for retail WoW, you do have to buy the most modern expansion. So there is a little bit of a higher fee to get into retail WoW, but it is the version of WoW that receives the most content, that the most players play, and it's probably a good starting ground. Now, there can be a lot of argument for if you're someone who's completely new to the franchise and you want to experience what World of Warcraft, the magic that it created for a lot of players the first time through, well, that's when you could turn to the Era Classic server and try vanilla WoW the way it was intended. And then, once you kind of learn about the game through that, you can then jump to retail, or you can go through a lot of these different versions of the game. A path that might make sense here is going through the Era Classic server, and then jumping into maybe the Classic server that's, going through the past expansions like Wrath or TBC. I guess TBC's past, or I guess Cataclysm would be the next one. And then you could jump to retail if you wanted kind of a really bridged version where you have the most vanilla version, kind of an in-between, and then the most modern version. Or maybe you just find you're someone who really enjoys the way the game used to play. And there is a lot of people who just preferred the slower pace and more grounded experience of classic WoW, and that's what a lot of those hardcore servers, Season of Discovery servers, and self-found hardcore versions of the game have been developed for people who just want to experience that version of the game in different ways. That's a very approachable thing too. If you're someone who really gravitates to old school MMOs like old school RuneScape or other older MMOs, this might be a great entry point for you. And if that's the case, I would again recommend doing kind of the Era Classic vanilla server just to try the most basic version of old school vanilla WoW. And then from there, once you've gotten a 60, trying out some of these more nuanced modes of permadeath and stuff like that. Because there is a little bit of frustration if you're a brand new player and doing permadeath. Obviously, if that's something you want to challenge yourself with, go for it. But I will say off the bat, there are certain creatures, there are certain dungeons, there are certain quests that all of a sudden are much more difficult than some of the others, and it'll catch you off guard if you're not someone with a bit more experience with the game. So just a few things to keep in mind. But that gives you a good idea of where you could start your journey in World of Warcraft in 2024. And that really brings us to the last section of this video, which is just looking at the idea of having these different servers as a whole. As I mentioned, this is one of the biggest philosophy changes for World of Warcraft and for a lot of other MMOs in the past 5 or 10 years. And, you know, it's done a lot of really good things, but it's also done a really, you know, some disservices to the game as well. So I just wanted to evaluate some of the pros, the cons, and what the future of this system might look like. So one of the most obvious one here is that a lot of players who used to feel kind of alienated from World of Warcraft because they fell in love with the classic version of the game or a specific version of the game that no longer exists, now have their version of the game returning to them. You know, there's a lot of people who will likely just continue to make characters and experience vanilla World of Warcraft in these new and unique servers, and that's part of the audience that Blizzard wasn't catering to for many, many years, and now they are being catered to. So that's a really awesome part that's come out of here. The other one, and we've already touched on this a little bit, is the idea of more value for your sub fee. The sub fee for World of Warcraft has not gone up based on these new modes being introduced. It's definitely, I'm sure, a conversation that Blizzard had at one point if there was going to be kind of these add-ons to increase the sub fee a little bit to get into these different game modes. But it's an all-encompassing sub fee that gives you access to all of these different modes, no matter how many of them are going on. And that simply just adds value to your sub fee because it allows you to do retail WoW, but also go and experience these different modes as they come out. Which really talks to the next point here, is that there's always something to do in World of Warcraft. One of the biggest weaknesses for World of Warcraft or any MMO is the idea of content cycles, where there is a patch and then there'll be, 3, 4, maybe even 6 months where there isn't another patch. And you have something to do for the first few months of that, but then you've done it and now you're waiting for the next update, and that's when you can kind of fall off of the game. What's really nice for players as well as Blizzard is that they can kind of stagger these different versions of the game to all have something new coming up, kind of spaced out. So maybe you have a new expansion that launches at the start of the year, and then a few months from there you have a new patch for classic WoW, and so forth and so forth. So you can have all these different modes that come active at different times, giving the player something to do throughout the entire year, which really solves a weakness that the game had. That brings us to some of the less good things. One of them is the idea of not really knowing where to start for new players. This is obviously what we're tackling in this video, is that as a new player going to World of Warcraft, doing some research about the game, it's probably pretty intimidating seeing all of these different modes and not understanding if they're like part of the same game if you make one character, or how you access all of them, or if you're trying to play friends, which version of WoW they're actually playing on. There's a big amount of learning that has to be done for new players to understand where they should enter. But one of the benefits of this is that there are more entry points for players that are just trying to jump in. One of the big things in World of Warcraft was the idea that the start of an expansion is a great time to join as a new player, because a lot of resources and level caps and stuff like that are kind of reset in a lot of ways. With these different modes that are always active, and there being more entry points being just kind of introduced, maybe there's a 2-year wait period until there's a new retail expansion, but you might be able to enter the World of Warcraft world with the launch of self-found hardcore or something like that, and be kind of part of the first players going through that. One of the most exciting things in most MMOs is being a part of that initial wave and exploring the server as part of the kind of the founding players of that server. So there's more opportunity to do that, which is great. One of the final cons, and this is probably the one that Blizzard has to be the most careful of, is the idea that the community is only going to become more fractured, where you have more and more little subgroups of players that you have to try and cater to. And the more they do that, the more they spread their resources thin, and there'll be certain communities, certain game modes that eventually die out. And for them, it'll be about retaining those players. For the players themselves, it's understanding, is this something that's going to go on forever? If not, what do I expect to happen? And that turns us back to the seasonal modes. If we look at the Season of Mastery, it was a fun time for a lot of players. Eventually, it did end, and they jumped into a different mode of the game, which for a lot of MMOs is not a normal experience. So kind of training yourself to be aware that there is an element of temporariness for some of these game modes, and that you need to enjoy the moment as well as the future. So just something to consider. But yeah, I think this video is long enough at this point. This was definitely a rabbit hole for me to dive down even. I did not realize there was this many active versions of the game. I completely understand that as a new player, this could be quite overwhelming. I think the one last thing I'll leave you with is that no matter which version of the game you start with, it doesn't have to be the only version of the game you play. And I think, if anything, there's a lot to be said for trying a lot of the different types of the game and seeing which one sticks. Maybe you find the pacing of retail or the pacing of classic better. Maybe you like the risk of permadeath, or maybe you like the forgivingness of some of the more regular servers. I think there's something to be said for trying all these different modes. And if anything, it just shows you the value that you're getting by playing this game in 2024. But hopefully you liked this video. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.